Depending on how you look at it, the original Jurassic Park is one of the most and one of the least successful stories ever told. On the one hand, Michael Crichton's novel has sold some 200 million copies, being translated into around 38 languages. The movie adaptation grossed almost $2 billion adjusted for inflation. It is at or near the top of many people's lists of favorite stories, and understandably so. I was a tiny baby when the movie released, but it's captured the minds of several generations. On the other hand, Jurassic Park can be said to be one of the least successful stories ever told, precisely because so many people are familiar with it, but so few people really seem to know it. It has a clear and unambiguous message, and the history of the world since its publication is proof that that message has not been heeded. If you tell a story, if your story is designed to teach people some fundamental lesson, if that story becomes one of the most instantly recognizable properties in the world, but the world does not heed its message, then the writer, or perhaps his audience, has failed in an important way. At a push, you might get someone to say that the theme of Jurassic Park is the perils of science. It's a story about science gone wrong. This is one of those expressions you might expect to read in a kid's book report. It sounds grand, it says little, and what little it does say is a misapprehension. Jurassic Park is not a story about the failures of science. Jurassic Park is a story about the failures of humans. Specifically, it is a story about overconfidence, hubris, the fantasy of systemic control by humans over science itself. The science behind Jurassic Park does not go wrong. The scientists and engineers do not understand what right is supposed to look like. The park's failure is the product of bad assumptions.
And now, a word from our sponsor.
Now, Michael Crichton might have got his MD from Harvard, but it was generally acknowledged that he was a better writer than he was a doctor. I'm sure everyone's had an experience with some medical type and sat there wondering, gee, you should be doing literally anything else. I used to have this experience every time I used an NHS dentist. Having finally decided to de-British my teeth, this time I made sure I chose a dentist who wouldn't destroy my mouth in order to save it. And that's where this video's sponsor, ZocDoc, can help you as well. ZocDoc is a free website where you can search and compare high-quality in-network doctors, choose the right one for your needs, and click to instantly book an appointment. From mental health to dentistry, eye care, skincare, and everything in between, ZocDoc makes it easy to book appointments with more than 100,000 healthcare providers. With ZocDoc, you can filter for doctors by insurance, location, and specialties, and see reviews by verified patients so you can choose the best, most convenient care for you. When you've found the doctor you need, you can see their actual appointment openings, choose a time that works for you, and instantly book a visit with just a few clicks. On top of that, ZocDoc helps you get your appointments fast, typically within 24 to 72 hours of booking, and you can even score same-day appointments. This is not medical advice. Damn near nobody on YouTube is qualified to give that to you, and I'm no exception. I've never had a disease Johnny Walker can't cure. But ZocDoc is a platform that lets you choose from the best qualified professionals around. You can give it a look-see right now at ZocDoc.com/lostchord or by clicking through to the link in my description to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. Thank you to ZocDoc for sponsoring the channel. Now let's get back to the video.
Please stand by for further details. We return you now to your regularly scheduled program.
The problem of false assumptions, that is, not the dangers of science, but the dangers of humans assuming that their partial knowledge of science is total, that is a constant across Crichton's bibliography. In The Andromeda Strain, Crichton's first bestseller, published under his own name in 1969, a deadly extraterrestrial microorganism is brought back to Earth by an experimental satellite as part of the SCOOP program. When the satellite lands outside a small town and is recovered by the residents, it causes mass death by instantaneous blood clotting. A team of scientists is called in as part of the wildfire protocol. They take the satellite and the organism into a subterranean facility for experimentation. The story explains at great length the various procedures and quarantine measures in place to prevent contamination. Nobody in the story is an idiot. Everybody is a professional, and Crichton's great gift for dramatizing the scientific method is on full display. The scientists do not make mistakes in the Andromeda strain, but the wildfire protocol is built with bad assumptions. Designed to contain traditional biological contaminants, its quarantine procedures are not only incapable of containing a totally new form of microorganism, they almost enable something much worse. The final quarantine measure is a controlled nuclear detonation, assumed to be totally effective against all biological matter as we understand it. But the scientists realize just before it's too late that the Andromeda strain is able to create matter directly from energy. If the nuclear fallback is triggered, which it will be automatically if certain failure states are detected, it would have the opposite of the intended effect. This most deadly organism would be turbocharged and released back onto the surface. At this point in the story, the drama shifts from preventing the Andromeda strain to preventing the cure, a process made much more difficult by a mistake in the design of the wildfire station. The scientists are only just successful in their endeavor. The Andromeda strain, in effect, cures itself. A rapidly evolving microbe, it mutates into a benign form and the threat is averted. In short, the ostensible disaster is no such thing. It's damaging, but if left alone, nature would have taken care of it. The attempt to control it was the real disaster. A brilliantly designed scientific station following all the rules, staffed with competent people, applying the lessons of known science might inadvertently have ended the world, and all because it was designed with the assumption that the contaminant was a known biological entity. When assumptions are tested by an unknown scientific phenomenon, they not only fail, they risk disaster. It's not a failure of science, it's a failure of human assumptions about science. The beware what you don't know theme is present across many of his subsequent books, and the plot formula broadly tracks across them. Grand scientific premise seems watertight, is undermined by bad assumptions, compounded by human error in some relatively minor role, administrative, technological, engineering, and so on. In The Terminal Man, a violent patient is given an experimental brain implant designed to cure violent outbursts that occur during seizures brought on by psychomotor epilepsy. The implanted device stimulates the brain when it detects an impending seizure. The assumption is flawed because pleasure is addicting, and the man learns to induce his seizures to prompt the implants, reversing the intended effect. The compounding clerical error is that a nurse forgets to prescribe a compensating dose of thorazine. The patient then escapes and attacks several more people. So, another attempt at a systemic cure suffers a cascade failure because of faulty assumptions. And it goes on, because Crichton was so prolific and so popular. The problem in Sphere is not scientific but human. Entering the sphere grants a kind of psychic power that leads to childhood fears becoming manifest in the world. In Disclosure, a powerful female executive's attempt to cover up her sexual assault of a male colleague is undone by faults in a data visualization device that she created when she changed quality control procedures in a Malaysian factory to try and appease the local government. Michael Crichton created Westworld, a Jurassic Park-like creation undone by flawed assumptions about the coding in and safeguards governing the lifelike androids. In Airframe, an airplane disaster initially blamed on technology transpires to be the result of human error overcorrecting a system that would have worked but for bad assumptions in its design. In State of Fear, probably Crichton's most controversial novel because it's A, his most polemical, B, polemical at the expense of the art, and C, it targets environmentalism, the system is environmental science itself. itself, and the flaw is the human terrorists who manipulate the public's ignorance about that system through increasingly fantastical environmental terror attacks. Common to all these stories is, number one, the targeting of a current zeitgeist issue, usually some emergent technology, sometimes a cultural zeitgeist issue. Number two, a clear and methodical description of systems designed by humans to produce a desired outcome. Number three, the degradation of those systems by a series of unforeseen events, particularly number four, human error and/or sabotage, and/or a misalignment of systemic assumptions with reality. Finally, number five, a Crichton self-insert character who exposits what's happening clearly and at length. In all these stories, science generally works. Systems generally do not, because they impose artificial constraints predicated on imperfect scientific or psychological knowledge. The weak link in any system, scientific, legal, psychological, technical, is the humans who create and manage it. Bad information is the real killer, because it leads to incorrect expectations, and so the systems we design to manage reality come into conflict with reality itself.
But the shock that I had experienced reverberated in me for a while, because what I'd been led to believe about Chernobyl was not merely wrong, it was astonishingly wrong. Let's review that for a minute. These are the low estimates of immediate Chernobyl deaths as a consequence of the actual incident. And you see here the UPI in 1986, at the time of the disaster, predicted that there would be 2,000 immediate deaths. The New York Post thought there would be 16,000. The Canadian Broadcasting Company in 91 thought there would be that many. And you see the BBC and the New York Times in 2002 predicting at the low end 15,000 deaths. Their estimates were 15,000 to 30,000 deaths. Now, there was a UN commission in 2000 that suggested that the catastrophe was nowhere near that proportion. And as you can see, the next UN commission in 2005 doesn't really show up on the graph because the total numbers are 56. To report that 15 to 30,000 people are dead when the actual number is 56 represents a very large error. It seems difficult to make a mistake of that scale. But of course, you're probably thinking we're talking about radiation, what about long-term consequences? Unfortunately for the media, their reports are even less accurate here. Here you see CNN in 1996 was predicting future Chernobyl-related illnesses and death in a large swath that would go from Sweden to the Baltic, to the Black Sea, estimating 3.5 million. The BBC, much more conservatively, estimated 50,000. Agence Presse thought 500,000. The Ukrainian Victims Group in 2002 estimated 150,000. The UN Commission in 2005 decided that there would be about 4,000. That's the number of Americans who die of adverse drug reactions in this country every 6 weeks. Again, a huge error. But most troubling of all, according to the UN report, was that the largest public health problem created by the accident was the damaging psychological impact due to a lack of accurate information. This was manifesting, as they said, as negative self-assessments of health, belief in a shortened life expectancy, lack of initiative, and dependency on assistance from the state. In other words, the greatest damage to the people of Chernobyl was caused by bad information. These people weren't blighted by radiation so much as by terrifying but false information. We ought to ponder for a minute exactly what that implies. We demand strict controls on radiation because it's such a health hazard. But clearly, Chernobyl suggests that false information can be a health hazard as damaging as radiation. I'm not saying that radiation is not a threat. I'm also not saying that Chernobyl is not a genuinely serious event. But thousands of Ukrainians who didn't die were made invalids out of fear. They were told to be afraid. They were told they were going to die when they weren't. They were told their children would be deformed when they weren't. They were told they couldn't have children when they could. They were authoritatively promised a future of cancer, deformities, pain, and decay. It's no wonder they responded as they did. In fact, we really need to recognize that this kind of human response is very well documented. Authoritatively telling people they are going to die can in itself be fatal.
Clarity was one of Crichton's great strengths as a writer, but it was achieved by a trade-off in which character was usually sacrificed. You can stick a Crichton character from one of his books into pretty much any other one of his books, and nothing much of the story would change.
In writing, I have always felt that I don't really understand why people do what they do. I really don't. So that
Or don't do what they should do.
yes.
Yeah.
So I'm always doing an external kind of description. All I feel comfortable with is what happens. I'm very uncertain about the inner life or motivations because I think that's all.
Or what?
Well, it's either fantasy or it's ex post facto rationalization or, certainly I've gotten into certain kinds of situations or certain things have happened to me that have upset me. And later I think, why did you do that? Why did you walk into that room? Why did you say that to that?
Yeah, me too.
I don't have a good explanation.
The stereotypical Michael Crichton character is Michael Crichton, a middle-class, matter-of-fact, understated professional who delivers fascinating information dryly. Their personality is so unimportant to the story that he often didn't bother giving them one. Sometimes the narrator will tell you how you're supposed to regard the character. For example, from the Jurassic Park novel, Lewis Dodgson.
Dodgson! We've got Dodgson here! See, nobody cares.
And I quote, "Depending on who you talked to, Lewis Dodgson was famous as the most aggressive geneticist of his generation or the most reckless." And Ian Malcolm from the same book. Ian Malcolm was one of the most famous of the new generation of mathematicians who were openly interested in how the real world works. These scholars broke with the cloistered tradition of mathematics in several important ways. For one thing, they used computers constantly, a practice traditional mathematicians frowned on. For another, they worked almost exclusively with non-linear equations in the emerging field called chaos theory. For a third, they appeared to care that their mathematics described something that actually existed in the real world. And finally, as if to emphasize their emergence from academia into the world, they dressed and spoke with what one senior mathematician called a deplorable excess of personality. In fact, they often behaved like rock stars. But this isn't really character, in that it doesn't translate very often into the text. It's really just flavoring. If a Crichton character is described as aggressive and reckless, then he is probably a villain, even if he's never aggressive or reckless in the story. If a character is described as a rock star, he is probably Michael Crichton's self-insert character. It doesn't mean he presents as a rock star in the text, it means he has unorthodox opinions that turn out to be correct. Sometimes the narrative will portray a character one way but treat them the opposite. I can't imagine why footage of John Walker is currently scrolling across your screen. In Jurassic Park the novel, Donald Gennaro, the lawyer, survives the story, and in fact he's presented as kind of a hero. He consistently volunteers to help with perilous tasks, putting himself in danger again and again, such as when he volunteers to accompany Muldoon to tranquilize the escaped Tyrannosaurus, or when he goes into the raptor-infested sub-basement to try and turn on the power. But the book treats him as though he hasn't done these things, and toward the close he is harshly criticized by Alan Grant for being a useless, money-grubbing coward. But this is because Crichton characters are primarily instrumental. Gennaro is in scenes to interrupt lengthy exposition, usually by Ian Malcolm, which, by the way, is a trick you should probably avoid. If your character has been speaking for 2 pages, you can have him say, "Do you follow?" and have his interlocutor say, "Not really," to excuse a further 2 pages of monologue. But ideally you don't do that if your goal is to have your characters drive your story, rather than merely exposit a foreordained systemic failure in which they've been swept up. Because this is Gennaro's lot in the book, he is there so other things can happen, he is there so other things can be said, his actions and demonstrated values are essentially ignored by the writer, because they aren't the things that motivate his character. What motivates his character is the writer's need for him to be in the scene. scene. The advantage to this approach, though, is that you can get away with monologuing, which is what gives Crichton's books their admirable clarity. The ideas are fascinating. The characters are only there as an excuse to transmit them, but where your point is to make a point, well, there are worse approaches to adopt. Characters can get confusing. Relationship drama doesn't always tell you very much about science. Jurassic Park, the movie, is much superior as a work of art to Jurassic Park, the book, in terms of its well-rounded balance of the four essential elements: plot, character, world building, and theme. But here, the trade-off entails a sacrifice in the other direction. Where Michael Crichton sacrificed character for exposition of the book's thematic and plot points, Spielberg sacrificed some of the clarity in thematic and plot points for character instead. Crichton and Spielberg are pretty much the ideal pairing for a well-rounded story, precisely because they complement each other's strengths and weaknesses.
There's such a reality to it that's why I got really interested in this, because I said, God, science and adventure, let's come smashing together, and now it's based on what is probably going to happen someday.
But what you gain in one area, you lose in another. It's an essential rule of reality. I love the movie, and it does retain the majority of the book's most important mechanical beats. But by making the characters characters with things to say and do and think that are not merely expositing the author's point, some of that point is easier to miss. Ditto the film's much more effective use of wonder, which undercuts the book's stress on cynicism. Crichton doesn't allow and has little interest in wonder. The miracle of Jurassic Park is there to be dispelled, and the reasons for its failure are the most important thing to get across in Crichton's mind. The book's opening lets you know this right off the bat. It's probably the most atmospheric and eerie part of the entire story. The prologue sees a helicopter land in a stormy night at a Costa Rican village, transferring to a bemused doctor, a young man who has been badly injured in some mysterious event over at a nearby island owned by an American multinational. The official story is that it was a mechanical accident, but the doctor is quite sure that what she's seeing is an animal attack. The young man dies. The last word he speaks is raptor. This terrifies the superstitious locals, reminding them of folk memories that have not been allowed to die, for young children in these villages have been bitten by strange lizards before, and it's happening more and more often. Later, the doctor walks in to check on a newborn infant. Those small lizards are standing around its cot. She sees what they've done to its face. Pretty fucking dark, as I'm sure you'll agree. Spielberg cribs the other part of the introduction for his first scene in The Lost World. An American family on holiday, their little girl is attacked by a strange lizard. But little of that made it into Jurassic Park, the movie, because unlike the book, the movie is a family affair. It's allowed to be dark, it's allowed to be complex, up to a point, but the light matters as well. The book uses its introduction, in typical Crichton fashion, to dramatize the scientific method. The lizard that attacks the girl is found, partially eaten by a monkey. Its remains pass through the hands of several scientists, and the system would have done its work quite early, potentially averting the big disaster on the island. But for humans. The lead specialist at the lab is on holiday. He's not going to be back for weeks. The remains of the animal are put in a fridge. Some phone calls are made, but because nobody expects to see a dinosaur on their table, and because nobody knows what InGen is doing on that island, there's no great urgency to the investigation. That something has already gone badly wrong, that animals from the park are on the mainland before the main tale even begins, is known to the audience, but not to the very normal and competent people who might have discovered it, but for their incomplete information, their faulty assumptions, and their human wants, like holidays. The movie tracks the decline of the island itself as described in the book, but without describing it in great detail. It takes the show not tell approach. It's more artful, but that does make some of it easier to miss, especially when the film takes more delight in showing you how wonderful the island's premise is, which Spielberg uses to make a point point that Crichton pretty much overlooks. There is no real equivalent of the film's Brachiosaurus scene in the book. The film lets you appreciate just how beautiful the vision is before it tears it down, and the scene tells you a huge amount about the characters Spielberg has created for those entities Crichton gave names. In the film, Alan Grant is awestruck and overcome, but non-committally. He is stunned, not joyful, not apprehensive, just stunned. He doesn't know what to make of it yet. Ellie Sattler is awestruck and joyful because she, more so than Alan Grant, is the surrogate for the audience's feelings about the place. Overjoyed at the beginning, becoming apprehensive after the reality of the raptors hits her at dinner.
But these are aggressive living things that have no idea what century they're in, and they'll defend themselves violently if necessary.
Culminating then in her confrontation with John Hammond.
We have control again.
I never had control. That's the illusion. I was overwhelmed by the power of this place. But I made a mistake too. I didn't have enough respect for that power, and it's out now.
Donald Gennaro just sees dollar signs.
We're gonna make a fortune with this place.
Ian Malcolm is almost amused that something he already believes is disastrous has actually happened.
You did. You crazy son of a bitch, you did.
And John Hammond is like a kid showing off his new toy and keen to move on to the next attraction.
Say again. We have a T-Rex.
The book's version of the scene is comparatively muted, and I quote,
Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. Read by William Roberts. Grant stood on the path on the side of the hill with a mist on his face, staring at the grey necks craning above the palms. He felt dizzy, as if the ground were sloping away too steeply. He had trouble getting his breath, because he was looking at something he had never expected to see in his life. Yet he was seeing it. The animals in the mist were perfect apatosaurs, medium-sized sauropods. His stunned mind made academic associations. North American herbivores, late Jurassic Horizon, commonly called brontosaurs, first discovered by E.D. Cope in Montana in 1876. Specimens associated with Morrison Formation strata in Colorado, Utah, and Oklahoma. Recently, Berman and McIntosh had reclassified it as a Diplodocus based on skull appearance. Traditionally, Brontosaurus was thought to spend most of its time in shallow water, which would help support its large bulk. Although this animal was clearly not in the water, it was moving much too quickly, the head and neck shifting above the palms in a very active manner, a surprisingly active manner. Grant began to laugh. "What is it?" Hammond said, worried. "Is something wrong?" Grant just shook his head and continued to laugh. He couldn't tell them that what was funny was that he had seen the animal for only a few seconds, but he had already begun to accept it, and to use his observations to answer long-standing questions in the field.
It's the film's allowance for the wonder that the book largely omits that maybe is the cause of the distraction, because, like Ellie Sattler, the film allows us to be blown away by the power of this place, because everyone really wants it to succeed, and our quite passionate desire for wonder in real life, as in media analysis, often leads us to overlook what the thing really is.
Had to stop these things? I'm sorry, it's kind of a ride.
What the thing is really trying to say. It was Spielberg's great insight, as epitomized in the changes he made to John Hammond's character. In the book, an old, really quite cynical businessman, possibly in the early stages of dementia. That John Hammond is well suited to the type of story the book wanted to tell. It's his baser nature combined with nefarious big business interests exploiting an unregulated field worsened by corporate espionage that contributes to the park's predestined failure. It's a fundamentally cynical book, but Spielberg's Hammond fills in the missing half of Crichton's story, the positive, optimistic, all too human reason we fall for good intentions and big inventions and doomed dreams, and we do so over and over and over again. The film does a good job of showing you the problems described in the book. Jurassic Park as a location, as an island, as a park, it simply doesn't work. Just 2 docks for a mass tourist destination? 2 docks on an island that gets hit by every tropical storm there is, making those docks unusable? The only alternative point of entry is a precarious helicopter descent that is obviously unsuitable for passengers. Mile after mile of electrified fencing trying to preserve a dangerous unreality. The unfinished attractions. The visitor welcoming cinematic that requires John Hammond himself to be there every single time it plays, center of attention. The tiny core team over-reliant on automated systems with a single human failure point who is in known financial difficulty and whose worth John Hammond refuses to pay.
You know anybody who can network 8 connection machines and debug 2 million lines of code before I bid for this job? Because if you can, I'd love to see him try.
Sorry about your financial problems, Dennis. I really am, but they are your problem.
Unsuitable flora.
You have plants in this building that are poisonous. You pick them because they look good.
Real dinosaurs that won't show up as reliably as the park ride attractions they are intended to be.
So much for our first tour. 2 no-shows and 1 sick triceratops.
No locks on the vehicle doors.
How many times we needed locking mechanisms on the vehicle doors?
Just one man, a big game hunter, underarmed because Hammond values his dinosaurs higher than his staff, who is expected to manage the most lethal and functionally alien animals on the planet. Dr. Wu's blasé confidence in his own genius. All of that is in the book, and all of that is in the movie. But unlike the book, which never lets you fall for the dream, Jurassic Park the movie puts you in the car with the kids on that first tour, and you find yourself as one of the passengers, just along for the ride. You don't want to hear how it won't work, doesn't work, can't work. You want to see the dinosaurs. You want it to succeed. Ian Malcolm suffers most from the movie's switch in tone for its opening act in particular, but overall he suffers most from its shift away from scientific exposition toward character-driven adventure horror. Malcolm acts as the book's ironic commentator, the character who keeps the audience superior to all others in the story.
His latest book is The Lost World. It enjoys a national release of 2 million copies. It is a sequel to Jurassic Park, whose film version grossed a record-breaking $912 million. I am pleased to have Michael Crichton back at this table. Welcome.
Thank you, Charles.
Characters who comes forward from Jurassic Park.
Only one, I think, Ian Malcolm.
He's the only one.
Yeah.
And he goes to Costa Rica.
Yes.
And he's the only one that will make an appearance.
Well, I don't know. Stephen may do something else,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
But in the book, my thinking really was that I desperately needed that character back.
Yeah.
You know, because he is the ironic commentator inside the story who talks about the action as it takes
And we
place.
thought he was dead, but
That's right. It's Sherlock Holmes when the Reichenbach falls, you know?
He is constantly ahead of the game, and his frequent expository speeches ensure that we, like he, but unlike his fellow visitors, know what's happening before it's happened. The book, Ian Malcolm, leaves us in no doubt what the problems are, how they function, and in many cases, when and how they will appear later in the story. The movie, by contrast, actually depicts him as the rock star the book describes him as, but otherwise reduces his role to a much more vague foreshadower. He gets 2 monologues which are not quite specific but are foreshadowing: Life Finds a Way, spoken to Dr. Wu, and his caution against using power that requires no discipline to attain it. Both are excellent scenes that do a pretty good job distilling a feeling of unease, but the film as a whole omits the greater part of the why function his character serves in the book. There's one abortive attempt to flesh it out later in the movie, as he explains chaos theory to Ellie Sattler in the car, interrupted by more interesting things happening elsewhere, which reflects Spielberg's understandable disinterest in that part of the subject matter. Chaos theory is a bit of a meme in Jurassic Park. It's actually memed on in Jurassic Park 3.
Did you read Malcolm's book?
It was kind of preachy and too much chaos. Everything's chaos.
Which is how you know when an idea has fallen from grace. And this is, as I say, understandable, because Crichton himself misused chaos theory, granting it almost magical powers of foresight that are very hard to pull off in a believable drama. It's a pitfall in Crichton's genuinely interesting approach to intellectual orthodoxy, the tendency to overreach for an alternative, especially a fashionable alternative, which chaos theory was at around the time Crichton was writing Jurassic Park. Chaos theory was really popularized by Edward Lorenz, beginning with papers and research through the 1970s and culminating in his book The Essence of Chaos, published in 1993, the same year Jurassic Park was released in theaters. Crichton even gives Ian Malcolm an exposition dump summarizing Lorenz, which demonstrates the exposition foil device I described earlier in relation to Donald Gennaro's character. And I quote,
Chaos theory originally grew out of attempts to make computer models of weather in the 1960s. Weather is a big, complicated system, namely the Earth's atmosphere as it interacts with the land and the sun. The behavior of this big, complicated system always defied understanding, so naturally we couldn't predict weather. But what the early researchers learned from computer models was that even if you could understand it, you still couldn't predict it. Weather prediction is absolutely impossible. The reason is that the behavior of the system is sensitively dependent on initial conditions. You lost me, Gennaro said. If I use a cannon to fire a shell of a certain weight, at a certain speed and a certain angle of inclination, and if I then fire a second shell with almost the same weight, speed, and angle, what will happen? The two shells will land at almost the same spot. Right, Malcolm said. That's linear dynamics. Okay. But if I have a weather system that I start up with a certain temperature and a certain wind speed and a certain humidity, and if I then repeat it with almost the same temperature, wind, and humidity, the second system will not behave almost the same. It'll wander off and rapidly will become very different from the first. Thunderstorms instead of sunshine. That's nonlinear dynamics. They are sensitive to initial conditions. Tiny differences become amplified. I think I see, Gennaro said. The shorthand is the butterfly effect. A butterfly flaps its wings in Peking, and weather in New York is different. So chaos is all just random and unpredictable, Gennaro said. Is that it? No, Malcolm said. We actually find hidden regularities within the complex variety of a system's behavior. That's why chaos has now become a very broad theory that's used to study everything from the stock market to rioting crowds to brain waves during epilepsy. Any sort of complex system where there is confusion and unpredictability. We can find an underlying order. Okay? Okay, Gennaro said, but what is this underlying order? It's essentially characterized by the movement of the system within phase space, Malcolm said. Jesus, Gennaro said, all I want to know is why you think Hammond's island can't work. I understand, Malcolm said. I'll get there.
5 hours later.
But hadn't you better see the island to see what he's actually done? No, that is quite unnecessary. The details don't matter. Theory tells me that the island will quickly proceed to behave in unpredictable fashion. And you're confident of your theory? Oh, yes, Malcolm said, totally confident. He sat back in the chair. There is a problem with that island. It is an accident waiting to happen.
Ian Malcolm's sustained attacks on Jurassic Park and the philosophy behind it for pretty much the first 2/3 of the book have a firm grounding in the study of complex systems. It results in what you might call the weak or the tame or the simple argument from chaos theory, the one that's put in the above quote. As in the other books I've mentioned, he criticizes human overconfidence in our understanding of complex systems and the resultant attempts to reduce them to human management that will inevitably go wrong. Seemingly simple systems with hidden complexities produce unpredictable outcomes. Any set of assumptions expecting simple systems will fall apart because of those hidden complexities. The more hidden complexity, the more unpredictable interactions, the greater the eventual difference between expected result and reality. But the fundamental irony of chaos theory is that if you push it too far, as Crichton does in the book, it replicates the same folly it's describing. It's a neat label for describing the problem, but the problem precludes the predictive aspirations chaos theory will often take on. Just because something is in principle deterministic does not mean you are able in practice to predict it. Put simply, it's one thing to say, this system is way more complex than you give it credit for and your park will go wrong, John. It's another thing entirely to say, this system is way more complex than you give it credit for and this will certainly lead to specific failures with electric fences, feeding systems, dinosaur breeding, and an escaped T-Rex, which is what Crichton has Ian Malcolm do in the book, increasingly as time goes on. So, what might have been a clear cautionary lesson against hubris is at least partially undermined by its chief exponent making essentially the same hubristic mistake, but being proven right. Chaos theory in the book takes on an almost magical quality. It moves from the simple claim, you don't know what you don't know, and is used by Crichton to refute that same point. Ian Malcolm does know what you don't know. His theory can predict specificity in a complex system. And because this is all quite abstract and technical, because it requires long expository scenes like the one I've quoted above, it gets reduced to a mere mention in the film, and much of the accompanying argument, even the good, clear bits, is either abridged or omitted entirely. This is what produces the vague dangers of science description of the theme that too many people, not necessarily you clever bastard, but too many people ascribe to the movie. The result is that the lesson, the meaning, the argument that the film does show in large part becomes comparatively easy to miss. On the one hand, a complex idea necessarily abridged. On the other hand, the introduction of wonder because the film understands that you really want it to succeed. Combine these two things and it is easy to miss, if not the entirety of the point, then the precise meaning of the point, and the depth of the meaning in that point. Unfortunately, we live in a time when people will miss a point even when you stab them with it repeatedly in the face. It leads to the assumption that Jurassic Park is popular just because dinosaurs, which is only true to a point. The result is that subsequent Jurassic movies are produced and excused on the grounds that if dinosaurs, then good. The modern attitude is that children are a simple system, easy to satisfy. The hidden complexity is that this belief produces retarded children. A book and a movie with one of the most important and applicable lessons for modern times is thereby reduced. In an era where ever more expansive public policy and supporting regulation is produced with the aim of controlling ever more complex systems, from the climate to immigration to international law to public psychology, we ignore the most popular cautionary tale against this illusion of control. We've all seen Jurassic Park, many of us have read Jurassic Park, and yet, figuratively and literally, we keep making new ones. All of the above might suggest that the idea of education through fiction is doomed to failure. I don't mean it to be quite that bleak. I would only go so far as to say that we have forgotten the art of engaging properly with fiction. We are perhaps definitely, too easily moved by spectacle and too deaf to story, to theme, and to meaning. This in turn produces a cascade failure that results in fiction that is only spectacle. And I'm afraid to say that is where we're heading next. For we have a movie to review. It is a movie like the other movies released in the summer of 2025. And as Ian Malcolm almost said, shite finds a way.